Some people lack even a shred of compassion. Cruelty seems second nature to them, especially when it comes to juvenile offenders capable of inhuman acts. The town of Pell City, located in Alabama, USA, has a population of around 25,000 and is surrounded by Native American lands. Despite its rich history, it is now a quiet town where life flows at its usual pace. No one expected that such a shocking and horrific event would occur in one of the houses on March 23, 1996. At 9:33 a.m., 16-year-old Mark Duke called the police in an agitated voice, reporting that he had found his father dead in their home. Upon arriving at the scene, officers discovered not one, but 4 bodies. The first victim was 39-year-old Randy Duke, Mark's father. A blood trail led the police to the kitchen, where there were no additional victims, but the largest kitchen knife was missing. On the second floor, following the blood trail, they entered the bathroom, where they found Randy's 29-year-old fiancée, Deidre Hunt, and next to her, her younger 6-year-old daughter, Chalisa. The older daughter, 7-year-old Chelsea, was found in the bedroom. Also on the second floor, the adults had been shot, with Deidre's body riddled with bullets. The girls' throats had been slashed. Casings from .32 and .45 caliber weapons were found at the crime scene. Post-mortem lividity indicated that the murders had occurred over 24 hours earlier. Mark, who had called the police, was immediately questioned. He said that he had returned home in the evening, found his father dead, and without going into details or seeing the other victims, he immediately called 911. The teenager was taken to the police station to calm down and be safe, as there was a possibility that the killer might return. Additionally, the police hoped to obtain valuable information from him for the investigation. Randy Duke was born in Chicago in January 1958 but grew up in Alabama. He was 10 years older than his fiancée, Deidre, who was born in Alabama in July 1967 and had just turned 29 at the time of her death. The couple was already engaged and planning their wedding. Deidre had 2 daughters less than a year apart in age. The girls looked very similar but had completely different personalities. Chelsea was active and energetic, while the younger Chalisa was calm and quiet. The investigators ruled out the possibility of an attack by Deidre's ex-husband out of jealousy. Everyone who knew these families was aware that Deidre had managed to maintain a friendly relationship with her ex-husband during the divorce and custody arrangements. They had no disputes. The children stayed with their father so as not to change schools, but their mother regularly picked them up on weekends. The former spouses had no conflicts over this matter. Nevertheless, the man was thoroughly vetted, but he had a solid alibi and was excluded from the list of suspects. Detectives considered Randy's secret work at the Drug Enforcement Bureau as a possible motive for the crime, as he assisted in countering local drug dealers. Could he have been killed out of a desire for revenge? But this line of investigation also yielded no results. Randy and Deidre had been a couple for over a year before the man finally decided to propose to his beloved. The young woman happily agreed to become his wife. Randy had a son from a previous marriage, Mark, who lived with his father. However, the reason the boy stayed with his dad was not that he didn't want to change schools. The real reason was that his biological mother had practically no interest in her son's life. She had left the family almost immediately after the child was born. Randy raised Mark on his own, and the boy's mother only visited him rarely. Months could pass between her visits. From the outside, Randy and Deidre seemed like an ordinary couple in love. The man sincerely accepted his fiancée's daughters, who spent weekends with them, and Deidre, in turn, tried to find common ground with her future husband's son. It seemed that the victims had no enemies, and such a brutal attack was completely unusual for this town. Crimes like this had never happened here before. The police immediately noticed that the items in the house were chaotically scattered, as if someone had committed a failed robbery. However, nothing of value was missing from the home. Money was left in plain sight. Something didn't add up. Why shed so much blood if the intruder's goal was theft? Why did he not spare even the children? The detectives were convinced that the killer was motivated by personal reasons. The local community was stunned by these events. This town had never experienced high-profile murders, so 4 bodies at once had a shocking effect on all the county residents. News of the tragedy spread through the town like wildfire. When forensic experts were removing the bodies from the house, a crowd of frightened neighbors had already gathered outside. Local residents were gripped by panic. The victims' relatives were in shock because just 2 days before, Deidre and the girls had been at a family dinner. At that time, everything was fine, and nothing foreshadowed trouble. Chalisa was preparing for her first beauty pageant, while Chelsea was carefreely playing board games. No one could have imagined that this meeting would be their last. At the press conference regarding this crime, the police refrained from making loud statements. The versions considered were 4 murders or a triple murder followed by a suicide. Such assumptions were based on the initial data collected at the bloody massacre site. The fact is that no signs of forced entry into the house were found. Therefore, from the very beginning of the investigation, the possibility of an attack by an outsider was excluded. The killer could only be someone from the family or a close circle of acquaintances who were trusted enough to open the door without hesitation. At the end of the press conference, law enforcement officials announced a $20,000 reward for any information that would help in apprehending the perpetrator. The relatives of the deceased categorically rejected the police's suggestion that Randy could have voluntarily taken his own life. Randy was calm and level-headed. He would never have done such a thing. None of the family members suffered from mental disorders or harmful addictions. It was evident that someone else had committed the crime. Moreover, judging by the use of weapons of 2 different calibers, there were at least 2 criminals involved. To obtain valuable information, the police questioned the neighbors, but unfortunately, none of them had heard or seen anything suspicious on the day of the tragedy. Meanwhile, the medical examiner completed the autopsy of the bodies. It was determined that the cause of death for Randy and Deidre was gunshot wounds. A bullet had knocked out Deidre's teeth, and the children had choked on their own blood after their throats were cut. Judging by the numerous defensive wounds on her hands, Chelsea had desperately tried to fight back. During the autopsy, several non-fatal gunshot wounds were also found on the girl's body. The bullets matched the casings found at the crime scene. Forensic experts spent over 30 hours thoroughly examining the victim's house. Blood was everywhere, indicating that the attack had been carried out in a state of frenzied rage. It was obvious that it was someone close to the family who had come to kill, driven by a strong personal motive. While investigators were collecting evidence, detectives were simultaneously communicating with Mark Duke, the teenager who had called 911 and was currently under police protection. However, the longer the young man was under the supervision of law enforcement, the more his composure surprised them. He acted as if nothing had happened, telling funny stories and jokes, seemingly not at all concerned about the death of his family members. With each subsequent conversation, the police's suspicions about Mark only grew. Meanwhile, Mark's 14-year-old girlfriend came to the police station and told them that the boy had confessed to her about killing his own family. The girl was invited for an interview at the precinct, where she told the detectives that not only Mark but also his friends were involved in the crime. She also shared other details about the brutal massacre. The teenager's friend agreed to record conversations of Mark's friends discussing the specifics of what they had done. These recordings gave the police sufficient grounds to call Mark and his buddies in for questioning. During the investigation, it was discovered that the 16-year-old young man had serious problems in his relationships with his family members. Several neighbors and acquaintances reported that there were frequent conflicts between the teenager, his father, stepmother, and her daughters. Most of the arguments were with his father, who was dissatisfied with his son's behavior both at school and at home. There were even witnesses who had heard Mark threaten to kill Randy. According to Mark himself, on the day of the tragedy, he was spending time with his friends. They went to the movies together. To support his story, the boy even showed a ticket stub, hoping it would be his reliable alibi. However, the medical examiner's conclusion nullified his story. The murders had occurred not on March 23 as initially thought, but 36 hours before the police arrived at the victim's house. When new facts came to light, Mark was forced to admit that he had not stayed at home for several days. According to him, just before the massacre, he was hanging out with 19-year-old Brandon Samra, 17-year-old Michael Ellison, and another 17-year-old friend, David Collins. This foursome was inseparable and was known in town as a troubled group. All the boys were questioned one by one at the police station. During a conversation with detectives, Brandon almost immediately cracked. He told them about a chilling dialogue that had taken place between him and his 16-year-old friend, Mark Duke. Brandon knew that Mark had serious problems with his father, who constantly put pressure on him. The biggest arguments between them arose over Mark's poor performance in school and the crowd he was hanging out with. Of course, the young man was rebelling against his father's authority, as is typical for that age, but no one could have imagined what this confrontation would lead to. On March 22, the whole gang gathered together. They visited the home of Randy Duke, Mark's father, and Mark asked his father for permission to take the pickup truck to ride around with his friends, but the man refused. As soon as the group walked away from the house, Mark became incredibly angry. That's when he confessed to the guys that he had long been hatching a plan to kill his father. Moreover, he had already gotten his hands on a .45 caliber pistol somewhere. Michael Ellison, in turn, obtained a .32 caliber weapon. Where the teenagers got these pistols from is not exactly known, but it is assumed that they were stolen. Mark carefully wiped each bullet and both pistols to avoid leaving fingerprints. Michael did the same, but alas, none of the friends had the sense to dissuade Mark from this terrible idea or at least warn his relatives. Upon arriving at the Duke residence, Mark took the .45 caliber pistol in his hands, while Brandon held the .32 caliber weapon. The young man was filled with determination and stressed that the entire family, all four of them, had to die. Two armed teenagers entered the house through the back door while the rest of the gang waited outside. As soon as the intruders were inside, they immediately encountered Randy. Mark fired but missed, and the man managed to throw a heavy statuette from the table at him. Unfortunately, this failed to knock the gun out of the attacker's hands. The young man fired 2 more times, and both bullets hit their target. The father fell dead. Brandon recounted that at that moment, the killer shouted for Randy to go to hell. At the same time, Brandon saw Deidre, who was standing near Randy at the time of the attack, in the sights of his pistol. The bullet hit the woman in the face but only grazed her slightly. The mother grabbed her daughters and rushed upstairs, hoping to hide on the 2nd floor. The teenagers continued shooting. To their great regret, Deidre did not manage to escape. 2 bullets hit her in the back, one of which inflicted a fatal wound. Despite her serious injuries, the woman used her last strength to put up a desperate resistance. Trying to protect her children, she managed to crawl to the 2nd floor and hide with her younger daughter, Chalisa. In the bathroom, the older Chelsea ran to the bedroom and hid under the bed. After making sure that his father was dead, Mark went upstairs, where Brandon already was. He was unsuccessfully trying to break down the bathroom door. Together, the underage killers managed to force their way inside, and Brandon finished off Deidre with another shot. At this point, they ran out of ammunition. Following Brandon Samra's trial, the spotlight shifted to Mark Duke, the mastermind behind the brutal murders. His defense portrayed him as a troubled teen pushed to the edge by his difficult relationship with his father and the influence of his peers. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution detailed how Mark obtained the firearms, led his friends into the house, and actively participated in killing his family. Forensic evidence, including skin particles found under Chelsea's fingernails, directly tied Mark to the crime scene. Despite the defense's attempt to argue Mark's emotional and psychological instability, the jury focused on the premeditated nature of the murders and the lack of remorse he showed afterward. Mark Duke was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death by lethal injection, the same fate as Brandon Samra. The other accomplices, Michael Ellison and David Collins, faced separate trials, though they were not directly involved in the killings. Their participation in planning and their presence during the crime made them complicit. Both were charged with complicity in first-degree murder and received lengthy prison sentences, though they were spared the death penalty due to their lesser roles. The case left a lasting impact, sparking debates about youth violence, peer pressure, and the effectiveness of community programs for troubled teens. It also highlighted the need for early intervention in cases of severe emotional or psychological distress among young people. Mark Duke's actions, driven by personal grievances, peer influence, and deep-seated anger, resulted in the brutal murder of his family and the involvement of his friends in a heinous crime. The justice system held all perpetrators accountable, but the tragedy left a scar on the community, serving as a grim reminder of the potential for violence in unexpected places. The story of Mark Duke and his accomplices continues to be a cautionary tale, illustrating the dire consequences of unchecked anger, influence, and the failure to address underlying psychological issues. Mark Duke was sentenced to the death penalty after his trial, which began 2 years following the horrific massacre that claimed the lives of 4 people. Testimonies from his gang friends, Michael, David, and Brandon, consistently pointed to Mark as the instigator of the attack, starting with his own father. It was clear from the evidence that Mark had meticulously planned and led the brutal assault from the outset. The prosecution built a strong case, bolstered by forensic evidence that supported the confessions of the other participants. Mark's lawyer, aware of the overwhelming evidence, did not attempt to prove his client's innocence but instead sought a more lenient sentence. The defense argued that Mark's father, Randy Duke, was a cruel alcoholic who had abused his son for years, leading to an outburst of violence when Mark's teenage psyche could no longer withstand the pressure. However, this argument failed to explain why Mark also murdered Deidre and her 2 daughters, who were innocent bystanders. The jury deliberated for only half an hour before returning a unanimous verdict on March 3, 1999, finding 18-year-old Mark Duke guilty of premeditated murder. They recommended the death penalty despite Mark being a minor at the time of the crime, and the court ultimately agreed with this decision. Mark's accomplices, Michael Ellison and David Collins, were sentenced to 16 years in prison for complicity. They petitioned for parole in 2004 after serving 6 years but were denied and were only released in 2013 after serving their full sentences. Mark Duke filed several appeals to have his death sentence commuted to life imprisonment, but all were denied. However, in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court set a precedent by banning capital punishment for those under 18 at the time of their crimes, which automatically overturned Mark's death sentence. He is currently serving a life sentence at the St. Clair Correctional Facility in Springville, Alabama. Brandon Samra, however, was not as fortunate, since he was already 19 at the time of the murders. His death sentence remained in force, despite multiple appeals, including a final attempt just days before his scheduled execution. All were denied. On May 16, 2019, 42-year-old Brandon Samra was executed by lethal injection. His execution was controversial, with many arguing that his mental capacity and cognitive impairments should have been considered more seriously. Critics of the case pointed out that Mark Duke, the crime's organizer and main instigator, received a more lenient sentence than Brandon, who was heavily influenced by Mark. The case sparked debate about the fairness of the juvenile justice system and whether age should be the sole determinant of maturity and responsibility for heinous crimes. While some viewed the execution as just punishment, others believed it highlighted significant flaws in how the justice system deals with mentally impaired individuals.